Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to a new episode, Political Economy of Forbes 15. My name is Niklas Hintermeyer. I'm a journalist of the German-speaking issue of Forbes, and I'm very pleased to welcome my guest today. It's Alice Pannier. She's an assistant professor for international relations and European studies of the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies in Washington, D.C., and I'm very pleased that you have time for us.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. As the first question, as I said before, you are based now like in Washington, D.C. What's the situation going on with the coronavirus crisis? How restrictive are the measures to go out to do sports or something else like outside?
I would say, so two things. First is that you feel that the US is an Anglo-Saxon country. In a way, the measures that have been implemented are closer to what has been done in Europe, in Northern Europe. Netherlands, even further north, or the UK. That is to say, unlike in Latin countries where the government has been heavily involved in controlling individuals, in the US, we find that it is left to everyone's own responsibility to follow the orders, to stay at home, to not go out, etc. So that's the first thing, is you see maybe a cultural approach that is different between Latin countries and Anglo-Saxon countries. Then the second element is that the US is a federal state, obviously federal country. And so you see the division of labor between states or even local governments and the federal level is quite distinct. The federal level takes measures in the economic realm, economic policy, but then it is up to local government and states to implement, lockdowns. And so here in DC, it's the mayor of DC who implements the measures. And so the city has been under lockdown order since the 1st of April and will remain so. It's been extended until the 8th of June because the numbers of cases is rising less sharply than in the past few weeks, but it's still rising. So the mayor has decided yesterday to extend, and so did Maryland and Virginia, the two states that border Washington, D.C., to also extend lockdown orders until around the 8th or 9th of June. Okay. Which means that we can go out for limited activities such as exercising or going shopping. There is, however, I haven't seen many controls actually implemented. So you can even take the car and go for a hike and you're not being controlled. Even though the parking lots are supposed to be closed, then parks are supposed to be closed, but actually people still do that to a limited extent.
Okay. Let's talk about security, the defense matters, and also about the transatlantic relationships. And there were many talks and debates about whether the United States should, within the framework of NATO, should still be the primary guarantor for territorial defense for Europe. And of course, also US President Donald Trump was criticizing mainly the European member states of NATO that they're not paying enough money to the budget of NATO. But do you think that the United States is really moving back from Europe in defense matters? Because, for example, there would have been this major military exercise, Defender Europe 2020. It was canceled because of coronavirus, but it would have seen like the most deployments of US troops in years. So what's your opinion on that debate?
Well, first, transatlantic relations have to be taken as a whole. And so if we see just in the current, coronavirus crisis, we've seen the US president deciding to prevent incomes from Europe, so cut the flights from Europe and entries into US territory from Europe without coordinating with European governments. And even people who have visas, such as me, who have a working visa but no green card, for example, are not allowed back on US territory. So he has put an end to immigration, including from Europe, including for people with working visas. So if I go back to Europe now and I try to come back, I may be stopped at the border. So that gives you an idea of how bad, the things are in general, at the political level and just so the atmosphere. So in that context, even when the US does not take active measures that go against Europe's security or defense interests on European territory. For example, the US did not pull out of NATO, did not, pull out the troops from Europe. Still, how can you trust a country to support you in if a security crisis should arise on European territory? How sure can you be that the US would actually intervene? So that's kind of like the general atmosphere. Then when it comes to specifically, US's defense investment in Europe. So at first we thought, well, it's not that bad, because again, the US, the Trump government did not withdraw from NATO, even though, it had denounced it as obsolete, etc. It continued to invest in what's called the European Defense Initiative, which funds US troops in Europe, US military exercises in Europe, infrastructure projects in Europe. But still, the amount has gone down since 2018. 2018 was going up, and so there was hope that actually the US is really quite engaged, even more engaged than under Obama. But actually, it's gone down in 2019 and again in 2020. So the money has been diverted to fund the border wall between the US and Mexico, actually. So, it's like $1 billion less. So that's quite significant. But again, it's mostly a matter of attitude, of how trustworthy the US government is. I think, if there is a change with a Biden presidency in November, the extent of the harm done will not be prolonged. It will not go back to normal, but it still can still be mended. If there is a second US presidency, it will be trickier. What we see, however, is that the current Trump administration has bilateralized relations with Europe. So instead of acting through multilateral frameworks, whether it is NATO or whether it is engaging with the EU. Instead, the Trump administration has really used divide and rule tactics to pitch Europeans against one another, especially against the big three. I mean, the UK with Brexit is a bit of a different case, but especially with France and Germany, really targeting those countries, really trying to prevent the EU from taking a number of initiatives in defense, and instead, supporting those individual member states of the EU that support the Trump administration, such as, Poland or Hungary. And these can have lasting effects, because the solidarity among EU members is fragile, and if the US fuels this unity, then this can have long-term effects for Europe. So that's pretty bad. Also harmful for European security. Just one last point on that is the US policies, for example, in the Middle East or in Africa, that have an impact on European security indirectly. For example, the US, without warning, decided to pull out of northern Syria, for example, or threatening to pull out of Africa and seize the counterterrorism efforts there. Obviously pulling out of the JCPOA, of the INF Treaty on intermediate nuclear capabilities. All of this has indirect security liabilities for Europe.
But to conclude, if Donald Trump gets elected as US president again, in November, at the end of the year, you wouldn't be so sure that the US within the NATO framework would still be the primary guarantor for European territorial defense.
So, in terms of capabilities, the US is by far the main European power. Right, so even though it's not a European country, it's the main European power in terms of the capabilities that it's able to deploy if necessary, including nuclear capabilities that are much bigger than those of European nuclear countries like France and the UK. So in terms of numbers, the US is still there as a guarantor. It's still tied to Article 5 responsibilities with Europe, etc. But in practice, it's the Trump administration has definitely accelerated a trend in Europe that we see since the end of the Cold War of, okay, Europeans need to do more for their own defense and security, because it's quite normal that if you rely on an external power for your own security, then that external power may have their own agenda, they may have their own priorities. And we see how the Trump presidency has accelerated those fears that, there might just be not as great a convergence in terms of security interests as was the case during the Cold War, and that it's clearly accelerating that trend. So moves towards greater European strategic autonomy, or at least European actorness in defense and security are I think, have progressed a lot in the past 3 years. I think the current situation with the coronavirus crisis may have an impact on the economy that may slow down some efforts in the defense realm, but at least we have seen in the past 3 years some progress.
That's a good point for my next question, talking about the European army, because you said this debate accelerated because of the Donald Trump criticism of NATO. On the other hand, of course, because of Russian aggression in the Crimea, like in Ukraine. Especially like French President Emmanuel Macron is pushing forward like the creation of the European army. Angela Merkel, the German chancellor, she wasn't also not reluctant in the speech in the European Parliament. But do you see it really as a future vision? Do you see it realistic that the European army could be created, like in political terms, like a common strategic vision, but also like in technical capability terms?
So the idea of a European army is more of a rhetorical tool for political leaders to use. It's not really a concrete manifestation. We don't see how it could materialize, right? So it's actually a tricky tool to use because it creates probably more harm than good for many reasons. So the first harm of using a term such as European army is that you raise the expectations so high that you're 100% sure of failing to deliver on the expectations. Why will you fail to deliver? Because even enhancing cooperation between two armed forces that are very close to each other, like that have the same strategic culture, that have the same military experiences, they're never going to be identical to the extent of even forming a bilateral army, right? So if you extend that to the EU, where you have now 27 members, including some members that are neutral, that don't want to be part of military alliances. Austria is an interesting case from that point of view. There is Ireland, there is Finland, that all have their own particular understanding of, the red lines that they have in terms of being part of a military alliance or anything of the sort. So you would have to have countries that opt out of that, and you have a country like Denmark that is a member of the EU, but not a member of the EU defense policy because they want to have their say nationally on what they do with their military. So you have already countries that would be just very reluctant altogether to take part in that. Then there is the practical difficulty that I was mentioning earlier of countries' armed forces just being different from out of historical experiences, just military culture, organizational culture. It takes a lot of time, a lot of effort to bring them close to each other. Then there is the political dimension, which is European army. What about NATO? That NATO is the primary tool for actually bringing the European armed forces closer together. It's NATO is primarily a standardization, organization that just makes sure that all the countries make war in the same way. So why would you have something through the EU, et cetera, et cetera? So there is plenty of hurdles and even dangers. Many countries would just shy away from anything that's called the European army. So that's not the best way to start. I think the most smart way of doing the same as the French president and to some extent Angela Merkel are trying to do, which is to bring the European defense policies and armed forces closer together, is to do bottom-up things. So increasing the number of exercises and exchanges of military personnel from one country to the other, and lending each other equipment and lending each other infrastructure for training and things like that, which are happening under the radar because they're not very sexy politically, and yet they are the most efficient, and that's how European countries should continue building what we call, interoperability. That is to say, the ability of the armed forces of working together, bottom up through concrete experiences, rather than using those unhelpful political rhetorics like European army.
So I assume you're also referring to, for example, to PESCO, the Permanent Structured Cooperation, Security and Defense on the one hand, and also, for example, the European Defense Agency, in order to enhance military capabilities and cooperation, investment, procurement, etc. in Europe. Mm. These two agencies, like institutions, are they quite successful so far? What's your opinion on that?
So again, we've seen progress, and we're going to see all the benefits of the recent initiatives in the coming years. But yeah, those agencies. So the best way to do that is to have incentives for countries to collaborate. And so in order to have incentives, financial incentives are the most efficient. So that's why you have initiatives such as the European Defense Fund, which creates a financial incentive for countries to come together to develop common military equipment. And this common military equipment then will enhance their interoperability, because it's easier for armies to work together if they have the same equipment, basically. And so in order to do that, the European Defense Fund allows the EU to co-fund, basically to match more or less the money that is put by the member states to develop in cooperation some military equipment, or at least collaborate in research and development, and then procurement. And so by doing that, you create a financial incentive to do things collectively, because otherwise doing things collectively is always a little bit harder, a little bit takes more time. It can even end up being more expensive if you don't have the right sort of rationalized tools for making your industries and your defense administrations work together effectively. So this European Defense Fund, this use of EU money to promote collaboration is new. It's a smart way of doing. And the European Defense Agency, which exists since 2004, will be involved in implementing that. Has been involved in implementing that, but we still have to see how good the coordination between member states, the EU Commission that has now this new role with co-funding, the European Defense Agency, which coordinates some parts of the activities, how all of this works together. That's one thing. And then the other thing is how much money ends up being on the table for this fund. There is always a risk that, because defense is longer term, also defense is not the usual area of work for the European Union, that it will end up not being a priority, especially with what's happening now. Although, these are high-skilled jobs that are behind this money, this investment. These are critical strategic sectors that European states all have an interest in maintaining, in supporting financially. So it could be that even despite economic situations, that this will there will remain this incentive for EU member states to implement all those measures.
The UK has withdrawn from the European Union with Brexit at the beginning of this year, and with Brexit, like, Europe is losing its most capable European military power, because with the biggest military budget, and also like technology-wise. How much will the European Union be weakened by Brexit, like when it comes to security, but also like intelligence services, because the UK is traditionally very strong intelligence service systems?
Sorry. So yeah, the UK has approximately 20% of the EU's defense military capabilities. So it is definitely, and it's about the same in terms of defense R&D, and it's got the largest defense industrial base, with especially BAE Systems being one of the top 5, I think, world arms manufacturer. So it's a significant loss in terms of absolute numbers of capabilities and size of the industry and budget. etc. At the same time, for the EU specific defense and foreign policy, we know that the UK was little involved in those, for example, EU missions, EU deployments, and it contributed something like 2% of EU common security and defense policy missions abroad. So despite its massive armed forces, it's been committed very little, right, to the CSDP. So that won't change significantly. It will be a problem, but more for the UK side, as part of this European Defence Fund that I was mentioning, because there is now this money on the table that it will boost cross-border R&D in defence and procurement, and the UK, as a third country at this point, will not be able to benefit from this money, so the UK will have a loss there. The UK, being outside of the EU as well, will not be able to influence those missions and operations abroad. It can be welcome to participate in those missions, but will not really be able to influence much of the mandate. So the UK is also losing some influence, right? And then on the EU side, when it comes to so the internal security or the intelligence aspects, that's going to be the trickiest. I mean, on the bilateral level or minilateral level, which is where many of the intelligence exchanges actually take place, much more that at the EU level. This will continue, and there is always NATO, obviously, of which the UK is a member, and we have to bear in mind that NATO-EU collaboration is increasing, and so if the UK continues to collaborate, to contribute to NATO, it will maybe also indirectly benefit the EU through NATO-EU cooperation. But then the main problem is for EU databases, such as the Schengen system of fingerprints, etc., identification system, and Europol databases. So for internal security, homeland security, that's going to be the main issue, because the UK has refused membership to those organizations, because that requires accepting the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. And so unless that changes, which is still possible in the years to come, because my own personal belief is that, you know, we're seeing now with the coronavirus crisis that UK officials are seeing the importance of collaborating with the EU on pandemic warning systems, these kind of things, or procurement of personal protection equipment. You know, they're seeing the benefit that could be had by working with the EU for that kind of things. So I think in the future, even if for a while they're not part of Europol, they're not part of the data sharing, they refuse the jurisdiction of the European Court, you know, it might be that in a medium term, something happens that makes the UK revise its position because of the need to collaborate with the EU. I can hardly see how eventually this will not be the case, even though it may take time.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, how it will develop. Maybe as a last question, because unfortunately we are running out of time, I would like to talk about like the global level, like international political level. Because Europe, under the former High Representative Federica Mogherini, there was this global strategy for security and foreign policy was created that, to put it simple, that Europe has to gain more weight and power on the world stage, on international politics. What has to be done more here? Because also when we look, for example, like to the Middle East, so to the Syrian war, Europe is missing. And what should Europe take a more proactive role when it comes to strategic approaches, like in world conflicts and on the one hand, but like in general in world politics?
Yeah, absolutely. So what we see that the EU as such, through the High Representative, especially under Mogherini, has gained a little bit of visibility, right? It's been more involved diplomatically. So it has progressed compared to the early 2000s, and even compared to the Ashton years from 2009 to 2014. There's been the EU global strategy. There's been the EU being part of the JCPOA agreement on Iran's nuclear capabilities. There's been the climate policy as well as a important form of diplomacy for Europe. So there's been some successes: Ukraine, Russian sanctions. There's been elements of good unity at the EU level and some degree of success. But there's been huge, massive failures, and Syria is one. Libya is still becoming one, and so the whole Mediterranean space, which is and the Balkans maybe in the future as well, will kind of continue degrading. So there's been massive limitations to the EU's ability to influence, right, its vicinity. I think it's to blame on the EU, but it's mostly to blame on the member states, right? Because the capabilities lie within the member states, and the EU can only produce common narratives and common discourses for EU member states to, speak with one voice in international organizations and international politics. But eventually, the policies per se will be those of the member states. And so, for example, in Syria, there was, during the civil war, before the rise of ISIS, there was an attempt by France, together with the UK and the US, to intervene militarily to stop Bashar al-Assad after he had used chemical weapons against his own population. But there was opposition from the US Congress and from the House of Commons in London, and the two parliaments voted against government attempts to launch a military operation against Bashar al-Assad. And so, typically, the France did not intervene alone. It was obviously far too difficult to do that, and the UK did not get involved militarily, in the US either. I mean, only until ISIS developed in Iraq and then in Syria. And so the reconstruction of Syria, I think, is going to be a key test for Europe's ability to also fill the gap left by the US, and to avoid that vacuum being filled too much by other powers such as Russia, that has benefited a lot from Europeans' inability to be more active on the Syria front. I wouldn't bet that they will succeed. I think it's possible that 20 years from now we will see a Syria that has not turned into a democratic system, and that has and where Europe has been, uninvolved and unable to change the course there. So it may be just one of those historical failures, unfortunately. But I think, again, it's down to member states' political decisions to intervene or not to intervene, because the states are the ones that have the diplomatic, the military tools, and the EU in the end has mostly economic tools with a unified economic policy, but that's pretty much it. And when it comes to something like the war in Syria, economic tools are not enough, right? You need something else. But then, the UN is blocked. The UN Security Council is not functioning anymore. So it's not all to blame on the EU per se. All international institutions are under challenge by power politics. So, yeah.
Maybe as a really short last question, because it's so interesting about Syria, because you mentioned like Russia. Don't you think that the position now from Russia in Syria, and also Turkey, is playing a part, of course, in the Syrian conflict, in an ongoing Syrian conflict, even though it's mainly in the northeast around Idlib now? Don't you think that Russia's position is too strong, like in general in the Middle East, that the Europeans could really be active there in the next month or years?
I mean, the truth is that if Russia, with the size of its economy and the size of its armed forces, is able to change the course of the war in Syria, then that should actually give hope to the Europeans that they also are able to change things. Because it's not as if Russia is not the US, it's not China, it's not a superpower, right? It's a significant power, but it's, so it's a matter of willingness to play, to be a part of the game, to take the risks of war, of sending troops, so it's not always the desirable course of action, but if those countries are involved and are able to change the course, then again, medium European powers should be able to to influence the situation there as well. It's a tricky situation on so many levels because the situation of Turkey being pressuring the EU with the leverage that it has on like migration flows, and Turkey yet being a member of NATO. That means that NATO can hardly, be the organization that will intervene in Syria now, because there is obviously no consensus within NATO on the situation. So again, I think it's going to come down to France, UK, Germany, if we think Europe, in terms of how they will design a policy for dealing with Russia and for dealing with Turkey in Syria, and as much as possible doing this with the US. But again, if Russia is able to change the course of the situation in Syria, then so is Europe.
On that note, Alice Pannier, thank you very, very much for answering our questions. It was very interesting. I think we covered quite a lot of topics, and I wish you all the best in Washington, D.C. and I hope we can talk again in the future.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.